friends. Welcome to episode 256 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 17th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Gabriella in Canada, Robin and Sarah in Georgia, Laura in Michigan, Kelsey in Pennsylvania, Karina and Tarvin in Washington State. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me either on Facebook, on X, formerly known as Twitter. My handle is at LMS_United. On Threads, you can find me at School Librarians United, and on Blue Sky at SLU Podcast, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. Friends, be sure to get your Hills All Die On voice recordings by the end of January. See the instructions in today's show notes. I am so excited to share this episode with you in early February. Friends, I did want to share some exciting news. Longtime listeners to the show know that Amanda Jones has been a guest on this show 6 times over the years. She also happens to be a personal friend of mine, and she has a book that's coming out called That Librarian, which will be available starting on August 27th of this year. If you aren't familiar with Amanda's story, I encourage you to take a look at it, and I've included a description right here. Part memoir, part manifesto, the inspiring story of a Louisiana librarian advocating for inclusivity on the front lines of our vicious culture wars. And we have to also mention that Oprah Winfrey, in a speech at the 2023 National Book Awards, said, quote, "Amanda Jones started getting death threats, all for standing up for our right to read, but she's not stopped fighting against book bans or stopped advocating for access to diverse stories," end quote. Signed copies are available for pre-sale from Amanda's local indie bookstore called Cavalier House Books in Denham Springs, Louisiana, for $29.99 plus shipping. I've included a link in today's show notes because, friends, all the books that are purchased through Cavalier House will be signed by the author. I have confirmed that with Amanda. Be sure to listen to episode 224. I announce a sponsorship with Literati Book Fairs. And now a chance to hear from one of Literati's Book Fair veterans, Caroline. Caroline Carr, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, Amy. Happy to be here.
You've had 3 Literati Book Fairs. You've always had book fairs. They're a necessity. But what is it that inspired you to say, you know what, I need to do something new. I need to do something different because, you know, that's a lot to change and have to learn a whole new system. And you take a risk by switching it up. So what is it that inspired you to make that decision?
Well, I was a little nervous about it. I'm not going to lie. But one of the librarians who was in my district had already hosted one. And she's like, "You're going to love it, Caroline. Try it out." And I was very frustrated at the time with the selection from my other book fair. They sent a highlight reel, and I showed it to all the kids in my school. And then they only sent me 1 or 2 copies of the books in that highlight reel. And I have like 1,200 kids. So like, that does not work for me. So I was like, well, I'm going to try it. And then it was great. I loved it. I'm Literati for life now. I'm like, you know, it worked out better than I even expected, even hoped for.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that because I know there are a lot of people who are sort of on the fence about trying something new. And in this case, it really turned out well. And are you going to be scheduling more Literati book fairs in the future?
I already have 2 scheduled for next year.
That's fantastic. Caroline Carr, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Anytime.
Friends, be sure to tune in to learn all about Literati and their very generous offer. Librarians who book their very first Literati Book Fair and mention the code UNITED when booking may qualify to receive a $500 gift card to Titlewave. Visit the link in today's show notes and call the Literati team to see if you qualify. And now a word from our sponsor, Capstone. Capstone is an innovative publisher and education technology provider of children's content for school libraries, classrooms, and at-home learning. Home of the award-winning PebbleGo research database, Capstone has a passion for creating inspired learning and intellectual curiosity in children. And I am so excited to be working with them. I am also grateful to Capstone for their continued commitment to support the podcast in Season 6. They are offering listeners of School Librarians United a very special discount. Visit shop.capstonepub.com and use the code UNITED to get $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and Capstone interactive ebooks. That's code UNITED for $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and ebooks on shop.capstonepub.com. And now for today's episode, AASL's Chapter of the Year, MASL, and my conversation with Jenn Baldwin, Tom Bober, Melissa Corey, and Matt King. Friends, I'm so excited. Melissa Corey, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Last week, you and I talked about your visual book lists, so it is so nice to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me for a second week.
You know, this a whole back-to-back. I knew I wanted to feature you as as a content generator, somebody who creates things and then shares them out, but also in a leadership role. This past October, I was lucky to see Melissa, as well as your fellow Missouri Association of School Librarians, MASL, be called on to the center stage of our national conference to receive the Chapter of the Year award. Would you please share with us your role on MASL's executive committee during the application process for Chapter of the Year?
So last year, I was serving a one-year term as president of the Missouri Association of School Librarians. So I served as president for 2022 through 23 and sort of took the lead along with our executive council on the application process for AASL's Chapter of the Year, which is something that we were really eager to pursue, and we're just absolutely thrilled when we got the news that we were named Chapter of the Year for 2023.
Well, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but the timeline really sort of happens very quickly once you submit your application. And I think that was something that I found really surprising, and I'm hoping to learn more about that. So I'm so grateful several officers of MASL's executive committee are able to join us today. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. And I know we just met Melissa last week. So in this case, I'm going to ask each of them to share a little bit about their library, the grades they support, as well as the role they served on the MASL executive committee during the application process. Tom Bober, friends, you will recognize Tom. He was very generous in joining this podcast years ago, recorded 2 episodes in Season 3, September of 2020. The first episode, Library of Congress, and the second episode, My Caldecott Experience. And friends, I've included links in the show notes. Tom is also a podcaster with the podcast Primary Source Podcast, and you can find that anywhere you listen to your podcast. Tom, welcome back to the podcast.
Amy, it is great to see you. Great to be with you. I am a K-5 librarian in the suburbs of St. Louis, and last year during this process, I was serving as the first vice president in MASL.
And this year, you happen to be, and this is sort of a moving up, you are now...
This year, I'm serving as acting president.
Fantastic. Matt King, I'm grateful you can join us today. Would you please introduce yourself? Tell us about your school that you support and the role that you had on the executive committee.
Thanks, Amy, for having us. My name is Matt King, and I am a K-5 librarian in St. Charles, Missouri. Last year, I was second vice president, and this year, I am first vice president. And next year, I'll be president.
I love every state has a way of making sure that leadership is something that is attainable and you are well supported, but you also have a process by which you grow into that role. and you're not sort of thrown into it sort of all of a sudden. Jenn Baldwin, welcome to the podcast. Introduce yourself and tell us what role you had on the executive committee.
Nice to meet you, Amy. I'm glad to be here. I am a high school librarian in Southwest Missouri in a very rural district, serving grades 9 through 12. And last year I was serving my second term as secretary, and this year have moved up to second vice president.
Wow, fantastic. I feel like we have all these different voices here to contribute to really give us a good understanding of what this process entails. And so, friends, I had an education myself. I've never served in state leadership. I think I've been pretty candid about that. But I'll tell you what, this whole process of applying for Chapter of the Year is going to be linked in the show notes. And there's so much to learn about it. I really found it incredibly eye-opening, but I also feel like this is something that many states should and can put on their radar. So that's one of the goals of having these amazing people here on the show today, to give us a better sense of what it is like to not only apply for it, but to make sure that that application has everything that really would sort of seal the deal on receiving this designation, this award. So I understand chapters cannot win twice in less than 5 years, but there's nothing to stop a chapter from repeatedly applying for this award until they've been selected. Would you be so kind as to share with us MASL's journey and if you had applied in previous years?
So I began serving on MASL's board of directors about 8 years ago. I was the public relations chair. And I know that we have applied for a minimum of the past 8 years, simply because the PR chair was a role that would gather a lot of the artifacts that were required as part of the application process. And I know that probably prior to that, it's just something that I think for each chapter, it's on our to-do list. But I know for a fact that we had applied for the previous 8 years for this particular designation from AASL.
Well, and I know that the artifacts are important to document the progress that the chapter has made towards these goals. So it does stand to reason. So it's sort of a gradual process. And friends, I realize we're coming up very quickly on the due date, February 1st for this year, when these incredibly generous experts share with us what it took to receive this award. I'm grateful because the hope is that more chapters around the country will put this award on their to-do list of things that they'd like to set as a goal. So, could you give us an idea what factored into MASL's decision to complete this application? It sounds like it's been on your radar, but, I have to imagine that there are so many other things that your chapter has to balance. How is it that you repeatedly have made this commitment to apply year after year after year?
So I think, Amy, that one thing that I noticed, and I haven't been on the exec board as long as Melissa has, but as we got news that we hadn't been selected the prior year, right away, the conversation was, okay, we're applying next year. What do we need to be focusing on? What are things that are coming up? What did we miss in this previous application? So even though, like you mentioned, there's a lot of things going on, and that's part of what shows up in the application, this application is always kind of, I feel like, in the background. And I think especially for Melissa, with her role as president, it was in her wheelhouse to kind of bring this together for the rest of the group and with the rest of the group.
I do like that there's a little bit of like a post-mortem. You're sort of like, okay, the woulda, coulda, shoulda, but you sort of do this reflection. And it is an exercise in the entire organization, the entire state organization, reflecting on the priorities that it sets as an organization. I'd love to hear what the rest of you were thinking, knowing that this was going to be on your radar this year.
I think it's good to have in our organization the idea of who's responsible for the application. I think it's nice that in our organization itself, we always know that it was the past president's role to help organize and get the application started. I also think it's a great tool to help us reflect over what we've accomplished over the past year and help us to make some plans for the next year as well.
I'd love to hear. What do you think, Jen?
And I also think that you need to keep it in the forefront of your mind as you're going through the year. So I know one of the things that we had talked about as an executive council was that we weren't really pushing the AASL things as much as more of our state. So throughout the year, we were specifically trying to put in like AASL grant deadlines and just include those type of recruitment for the national level, just as we were trying to do it through our state level as well, throughout the entire year and not just at specific times when it came up.
Well, it's sort of an accountability piece, isn't it?
So I think something that's a little bit unique about our executive council, and I think each state chapter handles this differently, but we have a role that's dedicated to AASL delegate, meaning that that particular individual represents MASL at things like chapter assembly, at national conferences, and is really able to report back to not only our executive council, but also our membership, anything that's really important to share from the national level. So it's a great connection. I also really feel like we had what I can only deem an unprecedented year in our state for Missouri's school libraries. And we had a lot of challenges and unexpected things thrown our way at the state level. So I think for us, one of our goals was to not derail the priorities of the organization and always be on the defense. But I think that application showed how we not only defended Missouri school librarians and in association with that, Missouri students, but also kept the priorities of the organization at the forefront for our members and again, for the benefit of students. So it was it is a complicated application, but it was really satisfying to see how we addressed all of these different components. And again, a year that had a lot of surprises in store for us.
I appreciate that applications are due on February 1st, which leaves little time for chapters who are considering applying this year. But could you give us an idea of the timeline that worked for MASL and the committee, which pulled together all the required criteria?
So I know that our timeline was about 2 months long. I believe that we met early December, by my recollection, via Zoom to sort of discuss what that application would look like, who was going to take the lead on certain pieces of it, things like gathering artifacts. The narrative is really, I think, the piece that needed the most work. And so I came into that meeting, again, not necessarily being the lead on it, because it is sort of, in our handbook, we have different duties that are listed. And so that is part of the past president's duty, is to work on that committee and sort of help organize that. But I never like to go into a meeting without something to edit or annotate. And so I had started a really early draft of an application just with all the different criteria. So we met via Zoom at least once or twice. I know the first time was 2 months prior, so at the beginning of December. And then we were in pretty close communication, making edits via Google Docs, forming questions via email. And then again, I know that we submitted the application on January 31st. So we were right up against that deadline. So it was about a 2-month process for us.
It sounds like the sort of artifacts would have been sort of tucked away in a file. So this was sort of like it sounds like all evaluations that we do, especially as educators. I can sort of see how this process would sort of gain momentum towards the end. But throughout the year, you must have been thinking about, this is going to satisfy this criteria. This is going to satisfy this criteria. Don't forget that this is going to go. It sounds like there might have been other things happening along in this past calendar year that had to be in somebody's sort of back of your mind. Yeah, Tom.
I think that, and Jen spoke to this a moment ago, along with kind of what I spoke to, is that we knew that there were certain elements within the application that maybe we weren't quite achieving like the application wanted us to. And so really, I think one of the things that we came into the year with was these are different things that we need to make sure that we have kind of as priorities, like Jen mentioned, like really pulling in AASL and promoting the AASL opportunities to our membership was one of the big ones. I would say one of the things from my perspective that we had going for us that MASL already had a lot of really positive things happening from year to year to year. Like Melissa mentioned, we've been making this application for 8 years. We weren't just kind of like filling it out blindly. I think that the organization had been growing for that kind of time. And the other thing I will say is that with Melissa as the lead this year that we applied as president, she was putting some really important initiatives forward. And those things, I think, also highlighted the work that we were doing to support librarians and support students ultimately throughout the state.
Well, and it's fun because, friends, and you'll notice there are links in the show notes because you can look at this rating sheet and the point values that they assign to all these different criteria. Yes, Jen.
Something else that we really wanted to make sure that we touch base with was our actual members. So we took that time at the end of the year to reach out to them and say, what was something that you really grew from this school year, or how did we help you? And there were things that those members brought up that we were like, oh, goodness, we need to get that in our application as well. And then as we started looking, especially with our word count, there were things that we could put in multiple areas of our application, but we wanted to make sure that everything got put in somewhere, so that where it could fit, we wanted to make sure that there as many different opportunities for our MASL members and for learning, for professional development, for all of the things that we had been supporting our members with were actually part of that application.
Well, and it seems like best practice. You look at these criteria for the sort of benchmarks, these things that these state organizations should strive to do. Whether you receive this recognition or not, any chapter which goes through this process is going to be better in serving their membership because they have gone through this methodical self-evaluation as an entity, as an organization. What are we doing to not only support our membership, but also make sure that we strengthen the state organization and how it interacts with our national organization? Listeners can find the link to the application process and criteria in the show notes. I thought the points assigned to the 9 different criteria were very revealing. All of these requirements are intended to build support for the school librarians in their respective states and then strengthen the state organization's affiliation to the national organization.
I think I love about Melissa, Corey, and the thing I love about our MASL leadership is that we really work together. And I think in previous years, sometimes our focus, especially during the past year, was how to increase AASL's presence in our organization. And one of the most important ways is we talked about community practice. As an AASL delegate, we've really focused on trying to get our members to be aware of all the resources that our national organization provides for us, including our community practice. So at all of our PD events, from spring conference, our fall PD, our summer PD, we specifically talked about the importance of joining a community of practice. Another way we talked about during our spring conference that year, we tied in, and Melissa, you could talk about this, how during our spring conference that year, we tied in our standards to match the AASL standards.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really important for state chapters, obviously it's important to stay connected to the national organization, but the national organization provides a lot of opportunities, especially right now in regards to advocacy within your own state. So some of the application really was showing that we were taking those opportunities and putting them into action. So a few things were AASL offered an opportunity to meet with different state leaders, especially educational leaders, and provide a copy of the National School Library Standards to them. And so documenting that with an artifact, or at least a listing of, we met with our Department of Education, we met with our Superintendents Association, and we kind of parlay that into some presentations at different administrator conferences. So our school board administrator conference and our secondary administrator conference as well. And we, again, not only talking about the standards, but issues like obviously book challenges are on everyone's mind. So that we obviously had that opportunity. It was provided by AASL. They provided copies of the standards, but it was on our chapter leadership to come up with a plan and enact that plan. And again, I cannot recommend taking selfies as often as possible. Tom knows that I'm a selfie taker, and I did not take enough selfies that year with these educational leaders because it was intimidating. But if you ever meet with somebody, document it in some way, whether it's a photograph, whether it's, a screenshot or an email or things like that. Because again, having that ability to, be provided a copy of the standards, meet with those leaders was really invaluable. And so we put that into our application. But AASL offers a lot of different opportunities for that sort of advocacy every year. You just have to know that it exists. And again, our AASL delegate last year was Hope Hunter. And so I have to give her a really big shout out because she was always on top of every opportunity that AASL offered and put that forth to Executive Council to take some action on it.
I think this is worth mentioning, but I will ask it because I think as somebody who has repeatedly applied for this award in years past, your evidence that you submit to satisfy the criteria must happen within that calendar timeline, that calendar year. The fact that you've done this in years past does not satisfy the criteria. It needs to have been done in that calendar year.
That is correct. And Melissa Coy highlighted this, I think, very well about taking selfies, but also create feeds during your Facebook or any social media. Anytime you share anything out, because I think Melissa, when she was going through and completing the application, she would go back through our social media feeds and say, oh, here's an example of this. Here's an artifact for this. So we had that within our social media platforms.
Well, and having that social media buzz, really only helps generate more excitement when you broadcast that out on all the different social media platforms. Here you are satisfying not only this advocacy and using social media, but also satisfying the criteria for this application. So let's talk about the criteria specifically, and which ones were the easiest to satisfy. Which when you look at the this rating sheet that we have, which ones for you were like, we could knock this one out easily?
I think for our organization, I think the one that came most naturally was professional development. We always offer a really wide range of professional development opportunities to our members throughout the year. So we're offering a really large spring conference. We also offer a summer PD day and a fall PD day, as well as other opportunities throughout the year for that sort of really rich professional development where you're hearing from presenters, you're able to attend sessions that are relevant to you. And I think for us, we also were offering, especially considering some of the circumstances we were dealing with last year, we were offering some monthly sessions as well as listening sessions on how to just deal with whether it was book challenges, whether it was a state law that we were all making sense of at the time. We were providing a lot of opportunities for members to not only learn from one another, but connect to leadership. And I think we offer amazing professional development opportunities, and that's part of our leadership cycle as well. So Tom's conference last year, our theme was sharing your story. Matt is planning this year's conference, and the theme is We Belong. And then Jenn planned our fall PD as well. And we have great attendance at all of those and are really meeting all of the needs of our members. So that, I think, just came naturally because it's really part of what we do as an organization.
Well, and that receives a lot of points. That's 15 points out of 100, and so that isn't insignificant. It's really important. Can I ask? This idea of percentage of your chapter being AASL dues paying members. I don't know because I have never been an elected member of my state organization, but getting your state, your members who belong to your state organization to also belong to the national organization, is that, for me, is that considered a hurdle, or is that something that's rather easily accomplished? I mean, Jen, what do you think?
If I was to think back to our application, that was probably going to be our weakest and hardest one to prove that we had met. But we were trying to provide the artifacts of showing that we were trying to get them to join. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And so if they don't know what the resources are that are out there and how the national organization can support them as a school librarian, I know I work in a district where I pay those national dues out of pocket. You're not getting that support. And so when you add the national dues on top of your state dues, it's difficult to ensure that to show the value of that. But that's what we were trying to do, is to show the value of what that membership would be. But if I was to think back to our application, I think that was probably one of our harder artifacts. I'm going to pipe in, and I don't know if you can move things around, but Melissa, I think another one that we can really talk about that's easy or easier was our legislative and the advocacy piece, just because we had so many things that Melissa had planned to do already at our beginning of the year planning sessions. And then everything hit the fan, and there were so many other things that came up that our members needed our support for, and how to follow through with that.
Yeah, I remember that one being a really interesting piece of the application, because at the time when we were wrapping up the application, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, we were actually just getting ready to join litigation against the state around this particular law that had been passed. And there was discussion amongst the executive committee around, do we include that? And what do we say in our application? And what does that say about us as an organization? And ultimately, we did decide to include it in the application, if memory serves. But I think Jen's right. Like, you go in with a plan, and inevitably there's going to be one of these 9 elements that something goes off the rails, and you're going to have to adapt your game plan.
Yeah, and I'm going to add one more thing really quick too. Matt, could you, for PD, could you talk about the Diversity Book Club? Because I think that really showed how we meet AASL's goals of diversity and inclusion.
Sure. The thing I love about our MASL Book Club is that it gives an opportunity for not only school librarians and our members, but also admin, superintendents, teachers, anyone to join our book club. Our book club's held 3 times a year, and it's focused on, which I'm very proud to say, we have a dogwood committee that makes a list of books that are recommended K through 12, and our book club chooses one book each, like every 3 months, from that dogwood committee book list, and we read it. We create discussion questions, and then we have an opportunity to meet via Zoom, and we have discussions about the book. I mean, the discussions are so rich. I think you leave there better, not only as a librarian, but as a better person, because you're able to have these discussions. And I think it was, I'm very happy to see it continuing to grow and continuing to flourish here in our state. And I think Melissa was talking about several things. We do several things well here in Missouri. And I'm going to say a lot of the times with AASL, we always push accommodations. I think that's important. We did the Rainbow Library, the Book Brigade, if I'm not mistaken, for that year. In addition, we always have ASL emerging leaders, ALA emerging leaders, which I think is always important. I think last year, and Melissa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, didn't we have like 2 or 3? How many emerging leaders did we have last year from Missouri?
Yeah, we think it was 3, yeah.
And so I think we do a lot of promotion-wise with that. And I think that Melissa really tied in with the AASL for the National Library Week. We did shout out for our school librarians, which I think was very important to highlight our MASL membership. So I think that's those are things are important.
You bring up some really important things. I wanted to follow up on a couple that you just mentioned, going backwards. First of all, the emerging leaders. Am I correct? Brandy Veal, Sibel Garcia-Cole, and Brittany Sheretz are all MASL members. So friends, when we did our emerging leader episode, I met them at AALA, annual conference in Chicago, and we talked, and then we recorded an episode this past September about emerging leaders, all representing MASL. Matt, would you mind sharing just a little bit of more context about the book club and the Dogwood Committee? Would it be possible to share the list of the titles that you were pulling from in our show notes? I think listeners might be curious to replicate something similar in their state organizations.
Well, yes, and I think the best part is you have the best person to talk about Dogwood on this panel here, and that is Tom Bober himself. And yes, we can share with you, Amy, we can share with you our book club flyer. Our next book club will be February 4th, I believe, and the book is Come Home Safe, which is our first book club this year. Was called Overground Railroad, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. And our next book, again, is February 4th, but it's Come Home Safe. And then our third book, which I love about this, is held at conference, our spring conference, so everyone can meet face-to-face within the conference itself. But Tom could talk to you about the Dogwood.
So one thing that we have in abundance in Missouri are book award committees, and students get to vote across the state for these awards. But one of our newest committees around books is actually a book list committee. So the Dogwood list is actually multiple lists of nonfiction titles from the previous year. And so we have a group of people who work fast and furious on this list, works and put out a K through 2, a 3 through 5, a 6 through 8, and a 9 through 12 list of some of the best nonfiction that has come out. One of the happy consequences of that is that the Diversity Book Club has been able to look to those lists and look for really rich and engaging titles that they've been able to then promote to librarians who are working with students of all ages. And we've been able to get together and discuss one of those books at a time. But some of those titles come directly from the Dogwood list. So you have committees that are kind of working in tandem with each other and in cooperation with each other to bring forth some really great events that support our librarians.
So, Tom, just last question. So there's a book club specifically where, if I'm correct in understanding, the librarian leads the discussion and it's with administrators in Missouri?
Matt, I'm going to let you take this because you spoke to this.
So yes, administrators are invited. Sometimes we have administrators within the call and sometimes we don't. It just depends because it depends on the time. But yes, it is open to all school admin, school staff members, as well as school librarians. Jen?
And public librarians as well, because I know that has to...
Oh yes, and public librarians.
Yeah. Any adult, really.
But I love that is just raising the profile of what we do, right? This makes sense.
It's one really good piece of evidence of the connections that MASL works to establish between school librarians in the state and other educators, which is one thing that I know we do really well across the board.
Wonderful. And again, part of sharing this is the hope that maybe other state organizations might adopt some of these practices so that they can not only better their own, organization, but also find ways of reaching other people, including not only, I find that fascinating that you're also reaching out to educators in the building. This is not just about working with the school librarians in your organization. It's going to have that trickle effect where it ripples out and impacts state leaders and administrators in our buildings who ultimately hold the purse strings to our districts and the decision whether or not we have jobs. I sort of started to talk about how challenging it can be to get members to also not only have membership with MASL, but also with AASL. And I want to pursue this just a little bit more because it sounds like your membership is self-reporting. They are reporting to you that they, in fact, are members of AASL.
Well, one thing I will add, just from a chapter's perspective, as far as the Chapter of the Year award, I don't think any chapter should feel dissuaded from applying for the award if they do not have a high percentage of members that are members of AASL as well as their state organization. Because we have around, I think about 800 members usually annually. I think we've topped that in the past few years. And we have, I think, around 12 to 13% are also AASL members. So I think in past years we considered, well, is our percentage too low to pursue this? But I think regardless of your percentage of membership, like Jen mentioned, if you're promoting the national organization and you're showing that level of connection and you're really making a good case for here's what the national organization provides, as well as the fact that as a state chapter, the connection to the national chapter is really important. We're still funneling that to all of those 800 members in the hopes that maybe that percentage would increase, but all of our MASL members are benefiting. And I think that was an important piece just to consider if you're wondering. And again, I don't know how the metrics work. It's not as high as some of the other areas as far as scoring. So I don't think you should feel like you don't have the ability to apply if you don't have a majority of your members also part of the national organization.
Right. And out of 100 points, it's 5. It is, I think that's very intentional. I think they're very self-aware. I think that AASL is very aware that that is a very high bar. Let's talk a little bit about what aspect of this is most time consuming, because our time is so valuable. I'm talking to 4 people who have not just 1 year invested in their state organization. You have invested years in belonging and being a part of your state leadership. So let me ask, what aspect of this really sort of required the most amount of bandwidth looking at the whole process from your perspective?
I would say the piece that was, I would almost say it was kind of transformative, was actually the very first part of the application, which is listed as governance activities. So I think when we first read through it, we thought, is this whether we govern ourselves through Robert's Rules of Order, or, how we're doing things internally? But as you read that criteria, it's actually looking at governance activities that demonstrate chapters' involvement in the community, education, and legislative efforts on behalf of your members. And that we could have written 10 pages just on everything we did that previous year. We were responding to Senate Bill 775, which is a bill that provided some consequences or penalties for visual materials in libraries that would have fit a definition in the bill. And again, I really think that was an unexpected piece of that particular year, but it was how we responded to it on behalf of our members that really fell into that governance piece. So we always have a day each year, and it's actually coming up in the next month, where our legislative committee, our legislative advocacy committee, partners with the Missouri Library Association, which represents public libraries, to go and advocate to state legislators. And having attended that day, it is a really eye-opening experience. There's a lot of education that goes on, really explaining what we do as school librarians. And I think most of the legislators, really all of the legislators that we met with, just really wanted to find some common ground and some understanding. So as we looked through that section, it was really about how we responded and again, internally governed ourselves and came up with plans for action for all of these, again, unprecedented activities, things, bills, et cetera, that were happening in our state. And so that was very time consuming as far as the application itself, because I've lost count probably of how many Zoom meetings we had, how many phone calls, how many messages where we were figuring out internally, how do we protect and respond on behalf of our librarians. But being able to put that down onto paper was really validating. So again, looking at governance as not necessarily what you're doing internally, but what's coming out of your organization on an external level on behalf of your members. That took a while to write all that down on paper into different bullet points.
For the first time in 8 years, you are not applying for this award. And friends, you can't see the visual, but I do have smiles on the screen. So, what would you say to state organizations right now who are tuning in? They've not received this award. They would like to. Let's think about and you've offered some really fantastic advice already. If you could impart something on the folks who are tuning in going, it's going to be this is the year we're going to do it. You're not applying for this again. You can't for the next 5 years. So what gem would you offer to folks tuning in right now going, I think this is doable. The hand holding is what we all appreciate. And hearing it from school librarians who have achieved this has really got to resonate with folks who are hoping very much that they can, earn this award.
I really just want to say that we have such a strong set of leaders in Missouri. And I know that my name's come up quite a bit, but I was really just a person who was putting pen to paper and had all the stuff already in my Canva account, and am an admin on our social media platform. So I had access to a lot of information to compile the application, but all of the work behind the scenes that Tom and Matt and Jen and all of our executive council consistently does is not, I can't overstate their level of dedication to not only our members, but also our students, as well as just the level of innovation and foresight that each of them brings to the table. And so I'm finished after this year. I'm finishing my term as immediate past president. It's been a long 8 years, but the last 4 being on executive council with these individuals, I could not have asked for a more blessed experience. And I appreciate each and every one of them and their support for what they do here in Missouri. We are who we are because of them. Tom, do you want to talk about that since you don't have to apply now?
I'm thrilled that we don't have to apply this year, just because it was such a task. And I say that fully acknowledging that Melissa Corey was really the one who, in my opinion, led a lot of that. And I think that's important because I'll make this my one gem. Know what role each of your leadership people can play. Who comes in and takes the lead on this? I felt like my role, and someone might disagree with me, but I felt like my role was coming in and looking at editing and voice and how are we ordering these things. And I think that for me was really important. Like, what are we representing? Because Melissa and others really took the lead on that. The thing that I tried to focus on was, how are we taking those things and representing them? Like, what is the story we're trying to tell as we're sharing all of these things? So I think each of us had an individual role that we played, and those came together really nicely last year.
How about you, Jen? What would you say to somebody who's like, yep, this is going to be our year?
My gem would be to keep on keeping on, because no matter if you win or not and receive the recognition, the students are what matter. Your members are what matter, and you're serving them. You're doing what's best for your state, and whether you get that recognition, which is fantastic and something we strive for, if it's not going to have some type of impact on your students in your state, keep doing what you're doing. Whether or not you win, whether or not you apply, just serve your members and your students so that they can have school librarianship can be the best it can be.
Well said.
if you're not involved in your state organization, get involved. Whether it is Missouri, whether it's Michigan, we need people who are wanting to take an active role in leadership in state positions. And I think that we have avenues available. Like we just created a new membership Get Involved form that we can base all of our activities on. So I think what Melissa is saying is, I think Melissa sells herself short. I think she was where she needed to be at that moment in our story that we're writing. And I'm very thankful that I can call her a friend and a mentor, and I can always call on her when I have questions. But I also think that the overall statement of this organization and anything we've done is to just get involved.
Curious, being awarded Chapter of the Year has to be incredibly validating. How has receiving the award this year changed your state organization?
I think it helps us validate what we're doing. I think it helps us reevaluate those programs and initiatives that we feel are valuable, and helps us make sure that we are continuing, like Jen and Tom said before, meeting the needs of our students within our state and our membership. And I think the beauty of winning this award allows us to know that we are on the right track, and that we are not the perfect organization, but we are striving to be better for our students in our state and our membership.
And it's not a stopping point either. Just because we've won doesn't mean that we're going to stop doing what we're doing. There are things on our radar in legislative wise, in terms of standards, learning standards, that we're still working on and making that a priority for the next few years, so that we can make sure that our students and our school librarianship is still supported.
And it helps us grow, right, Jen? It helps us grow as an organization. We're continuing to grow. And I think that's the best part. And it's nice because it's kind of like a continuous jumping off point. So this is what we accomplished, when Melissa was president, and then it gives Tom kind of like a blueprint. Okay, now this is where we're going this year. And then it will allow me to go, so this is, and then it continues that constant growth that all chapters need to do to make sure that they're meeting the needs, again, as I said, of their students and their members.
Well, and it really does sort of lead into my very last question is, it's January. You've received Chapter of the Year. Where do you go from here? And I know we're talking to the current president of your organization. What kinds of goals would you feel comfortable sharing with us at this point moving into this next year?
Well, I don't know if it's so much based off of receiving this recognition. I think it really is looking at what Matt just mentioned, which is building upon the work that the previous president has done. And so Melissa, as I mentioned, had a lot of amazing initiatives which are still coming to fruition. We're having a new award list that is coming out in the next weeks for the first time. And that was under Melissa's tutelage that all came together. We're looking for opportunities to then where can we build on those things? So some of what I'm doing this year is to some degree take a lot of what Melissa did and say, hey, where's the housekeeping for all this? Do we have everything in order? So we're looking at all of our committee handbooks and making sure that those look good, and making sure that we can, that all of the changes that have come into place actually are documented properly. Those aren't necessarily exciting things, but we have kind of this ebb and flow of what is happening within the organization. And it gives, I think, the organization a time to breathe and to take in all these new initiatives. And then we continue to look for new opportunities as well. So we've got some new opportunities with connections between school librarians and administration that I haven't even fully shared with the rest of Executive Council yet, but a new task force that has been put into place. And so we're just always looking for new opportunities. And as Matt mentioned, he's going to build upon that Jenn will build upon that. And that's how you get an organization that continually is growing and evolving for the betterment of the students and the membership that it serves.
Oh, that's so exciting. It's a marathon, not a race. This has always been, whether you are a librarian in a small school, a large school, or you're overseeing entire districts, we're playing the long game always. Friends, I know that there are listeners tuning in who would love to add you to their PLN. Thanks to Melissa Corey, I now have a link tree. But I'd love to, I'm hoping that we would perhaps include in our show notes today your preferred social media. So let's go ahead. Jenn, do you want to share with us, where can we find you on social media?
Right now, I'm not as active on social media as I used to be, but I do have Twitter X. It's j_Baldwin_books. I'll check it more regularly. I'm still getting involved in some other things, but social media has kind of taken that back road just to be there.
Fantastic. How about you, Tom?
You can find me at CaptainLibrary on X, also known as Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok.
Excellent. And we'll also make sure to put a link to your podcast. And hopefully I've got a lot of listeners who love listening to podcasts each week. How about you, Melissa Corey? Let's go ahead. Where can we find you? We talked just like last week.
My social media platform of choice right now is probably Instagram. I am at Melissa Corey. I'm still on X as well. And I'm also on TikTok as at Melissa Corey Library. And please follow me on Blue Sky. I don't remember my username. It's probably at Melissa Corey, but I'll put my Blue Sky on there too.
Fantastic. How about you, Matt?
I am at King of Library on X, formerly Twitter, and Blue Sky as well.
Awesome. Listen, you are all wonderful people. Friends, we are in a deep freeze right now here in the Midwest. Our folks in Missouri, you've had multiple days off of school. I think we were comparing the temperature. It's only 9 degrees Fahrenheit here in Michigan, but you are much colder than that. And it's really unpleasant. So I'm very grateful you're able to, find some time this Sunday to record. And I'm very grateful for everything you've shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
If you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really like listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find us. One last friendly reminder, use the code UNITED to take advantage of Capstone's generous $20 discount off an order of $100 or more, and School Librarians United who book their very first Literati Book Fair for this school year and mention the code UNITED when booking may qualify to receive a $500 gift card to Titlewave. Visit the link in today's show notes and call the Literati team to see if you qualify. The topic of our next episode will be building a brand and my conversation with Susan Ballard and Sarah Kelly-Johns. I hope you will tune in.